When their ships landed on Earth, the Galactic generals were intimidating, enormous, and armored. They were giants in their technology, used to triumph and unopposed over the stars. As they looked over the terrain beneath, a glimmer of their features lit up with laughter to them. Earth was just a backward. The generals assembled atop the high ground, gazing over a landscape littered with ancient artifacts, while the planet clung to remnants of the past. Soldiers carrying what they viewed as primitive weapons of war and world structures exchanged glances that were impossible to conceal. Word had gotten out that Earth's defenders were using antiquated weapons, including bows, of all things, according to one general. Openly mocking bows, do they think they can stop us with sticks and strings? Others chuckled, amused by the idea that they had witnessed planets with supposedly powerful species collapse easily, disintegrating under the general's sophisticated technology. But there was an odd resistance on Earth. Despite the odds, the humans appeared tough and unwilling to give up. Generals, it was all vain courage and a show of resistance that would soon come to an end when their troops scattered. The generals watched with disinterest, anticipating the collapse of Earth's defenses. In comparison to the sleek, Earth's armor and weapons were far less advanced than their own efficiency of the alien arsenal. The generals relaxed, knowing that as the soldiers advanced, this would be another simple conquest. But then they noticed a glimmer that almost unnoticeable in the distance. They focused their improved vision on a lone man advancing stealthily. They initially believed it to be just another foot soldier moving over the landscape, but then they spotted something strange. Unlike the others, the human was not rushing in terror. Instead, he moved precisely, calculating each step and breathing each time. Somewhat intrigued but still amused, the general peered, and then it was ridiculous that an arrow was thrown into the air from this figure's hands with a whisper of sound. Thought an arrow against their armor, but they watched as the arrows slashed before they could chuckle. Swiftly flew through the air and killed one of their soldiers, causing the soldier's armor to pierce cleanly. They blinked in an attempt to make sense of the silence that hung over them. One of them muttered, "What just happened must be a glitch or fault," and the others agreed with the armor and dismissed the episode as an exception. They couldn't think of anything else. But while they kept watching, the lone archer moved once more. The generals issued further orders quickly and deliberately, as though the troops' deaths had been normal. Soldiers moving forward and requesting that they eradicate this unimportant annoyance. But with every wave with unwavering accuracy, the archer hit each arrow landing, sending every soldier plummeting before they could respond. Confusion started to seep into the generals' thoughts as they attempted to make sense of it, but nothing changed. Occurred often, with arrows striking armor and causing men to fall. Perhaps one of them muttered, not believing what he was witnessing, while another general shook his head. No. It's an artifact and an outdated weapon, therefore it can't be. His words trailed off as another arrow flew, the archer's hand moving with such grace and speed that it nearly captivated their attention. Pride started to falter, giving way to a strange irritation and then uncertainty. They had witnessed several conflicts with various weapons, but in this instance, a lone person with a bow was doing more harm than good. The generals exchanged uncomfortable looks as they felt their power slipping more than they had ever expected. Unspoken queries flashed through their minds as they examined how this could have happened. The readings were adjusted to reflect their armor's resistance, and they comforted one another that this was only a short-term issue. Another soldier fell after speaking, and then the archer moved in silence, effectively, almost as though he were playing with them, leaving the generals dumbfounded. Their soldiers, once brave and loyal members, started to hesitate, looking anxiously at the archer's position as whispers sounded among them. The generals attempted to stop it with silent cries of uncertainty and terror, telling their troops to advance and crush this lone individual, but they were secretly starting to have a tiny nagging feeling that they had never experienced before. Feeling of vulnerability, they kept a careful eye on him, not with disdain this time, but the archer stood his ground at every turn with an odd, grudging respect. Purposeful, his expression composed and intent, he was not afraid, only a feeling of he seemed to have been born with this unnerving purpose, as though each step, every inhalation and bowstring pull, was a deliberate component of his strategy. One of the generals clenched his teeth, his haughtiness giving way to a simmering, deep rage. How could this be him? Hissed, unable to control his annoyance, but the others were at a loss for responses. They were stunned for the first time in their lengthy and distinguished careers as the archer released another arrow and another soldier dropped. The archer remained composed and unflinching, aiming precisely. Whistling another arrow in the air, It always found its mark. Every shot landed with an almost. The alien soldiers were renowned for their surgical precision, slicing through their sophisticated armor as if it were paper. As panic began to seep throughout their ranks, their discipline and fortitude began to wane, and their actions became unpredictable. Never encountered an adversary like him, whose proficiency with a basic bow defied their technology and reasoning. Generals observed their initial amusement turning into uneasiness, assumed that the archer posed no threat because of their advanced armor and weapons. Despite his invincibility, he was destroying their forces one by one with unsettling effectiveness. Every arrow served as a declaration and a reminder that they had misjudged him, and the resentment and irritation that simmered among the generals gave orders for their troops to close in when they became aware that they were losing control of the battlefield. Overwhelm him with sheer numbers in the belief that he would be unable to withstand such a barrage, but the archer moved fluidly, making every move deliberate and never wasting a stride. His environmental awareness was astounding, and he expected them to move while always remaining just out of reach. Every time they believed they had him encircled, he let himself be cornered and slipped away, departing. Following the death of another soldier, the generals began to become increasingly uneasy about their faith in their plan coming apart as they observed him casually destroying their ranks, unable to endure as the loss increased. A general ordered the use of specialized drones with thermal tracking, confident that the archer's rampage would eventually come to an end as the drones flew through the skies, their sensors trained on find the smallest heat signature. But the archer foresaw this action and merged with the surroundings, his motions planned to evade notice. It was as if he was naturally aware of the drone's range. He would have kept them just out of sight as they gradually lost. The general's operatives are having trouble keeping up with his fluctuating position as they try to monitor him. Observed in shock as their cutting-edge equipment, intended to find even the most elusive targets, failed against a solitary individual with only a bow, their annoyance heightened by the addition of an unaccustomed to experiencing a hint of tension. The archer's arrows appeared to do more than just pierce armor. Pierced the alien force's morale, with each soldier who lost their general seeing the growing uneasiness in their ranks, in their soldiers' eyes, and the hesitancy that now marks. Every time they moved, the archer was influencing their mentality and sowing uncertainty, which went beyond a simple tactical problem. They had never imagined that a primitive weapon could have such power, and they were terrified with every silent hit. An enemy brandishing a bow might force them to reevaluate their plan. A general tightened his hands, furious. Annoyance at the fact that this person is doing this after destroying entire worlds and bringing civilizations to their knees. But now that a lone archer had stung them, reality was starting to set in. To realize that this person was a real menace and not simply a small irritation. Enemy, his proficiency with the bow was indisputable, elevating it above the status of an antiquated weapon. The generals had to face the unsettling reality that they were. In order to deal with a fighter rather than merely a primitive, each general began giving commands quickly. More desperate than the last time, they attempted to disperse their troops in tighter formations to prevent being simple targets. But that didn't matter, because the archer easily adjusted his aim. They couldn't comprehend how he maintained his unshakable confidence. How he managed to stay so composed and accurate in the face of turmoil was as if his patience and talent were limitless. Their warriors' fear would only increase with each day that went by. One of the generals ordered a direct attack on the archer's final position in a last-ditch effort to seize power. Soldiers hurried to the known location in the hopes that brute force would eventually defeat him, armor shining and weapons drawn, but the archer was prepared and struck with a speed and accuracy that left them reeling, with every shot placed so precisely that even the most skilled soldiers had no chance because he was unrelenting. His motions were so accurate, and trying to give the impression that he was always one step ahead. The general looked on helplessly. Their minds were racing with schemes as their forces were being annihilated, but every plan they came up with failed under the archer's relentless attack made it quite evident that this was no coincidence. Had an unaccounted for degree of proficiency and a mastery of his weapon that was beyond anything they had ever came across. The archer, who was demonstrating with each arrow that their presumptions had been terribly incorrect for the generals, who took pleasure in their abilities, experienced the sting of inadequacy at that time. Seeing their forces disintegrate under the control of a single individual equipped with their weapons demonstrated their invincibility. They were paying the price they exchanged for what was considered an outdated weapon because their conceit had blinded them. Anxious looks and a tacit admission that their standing was deteriorating. The archer had destroyed their impression of by demonstrating to them that as the section drew to a close, the generals' skill could in fact compete with technology, were struggling with the harsh realization that they had undervalued their opponent. And as a result, they had their entire mission was in danger since the archer's presence hung over them, serving as a reminder that they were no longer in control. The archer stayed concealed and blended in perfectly with his surroundings, making every action intentional. Most people were unaware of his strategic presence, yet his arrows kept hitting their targets with now well conscious of the danger he posed. Precision the Galactic Gen was terrifying. Changed their strategy in an attempt to corner him, they used their tactical knowledge to position their troops to encircle his last known position, but the archer successfully negotiated the terrain with ease, disappearing from view any time they believed they had him confined. Each shot was a well-planned maneuver. He sent arrows with the goal of maximum impact, not only to destroy but also to disturb, entering crucial areas, tearing down machinery, upsetting formations, and each fallen soldier who targeted leadership within their ranks added to the chaos, and the formerly disciplined battalions became more disorganized, and the generals observed their soldiers hesitating. Each arrow reaffirms their misgivings as the anxiety spreads through them like a virus. Archers were masters of both skill and psychological warfare, and he was fully aware of. The generals ordered advanced drones back into the field to determine where to hit in order to disturb them. The archer changed his strategy once more in the hopes that they would counter his movements, but he discovered blind spots creeping into. Although they had spent years refining this technology, the natural cover confused the drone sensors, yet against his adaptable plan. But it was ineffective since he moved like a ghost, anticipating their search trends, taking advantage of them, and leaving no trace for them to follow. It seemed as though he was speaking, as each shot conveyed a message to the generals as well as the men, via his arrows, informing them that they had misjudged him and the weapon he was using. Each arrow he fired was intended a covert critique of their conceit, which the generals had believed. They began to doubt the choices they had made because of their unquestionable dominance, priceless time and money, and their frustration grew with each unsuccessful attempt to defeat him. It was about total control of his weapon, his surroundings, and himself, not just about striking targets. As if reading their thoughts, he kept one step ahead of them while on the battlefield. His moves were so accurate that even when they tried different strategies, he turned them all into failed attempts. The generals realized that although they had briefly seen him, he had quickly disappeared yet again. They were up against a warrior who had perfected his skills and didn't require the technology. They depended on the understanding that this wasn't merely an archer. Someone who had spent his entire life learning a talent they had written off as being out of date had contributed the most. Sophisticated weaponry in the galaxy. But it didn't matter because the bow he was holding was more potent than anything they had ever seen. The generals believed the technology would ensure their triumph. But the archer was demonstrating to them that their own methods of power were based on skill and cunning, able to defeat even the most sophisticated equipment. But as the generals' annoyance increased, they started to question their conception of war had always been based on technological prowess, sheer numbers, and firepower, superiority. But this archer had taught them a style of combat that they had never really grasped. Didn't require brute force. Instead, he worked with patience, precision, and awareness that was beyond their comprehension. It seemed as though he was assessing every move on the battlefield from a higher vantage. The generals tried to disrupt his rhythm by ordering a relentless barrage aimed at every possible spot he might use to hide. The trees and boulders went to rubble as the ground trembled and explosions rattled the landscape. They anticipated that he would be flushed out by this display of power, but the archer adjusted by using the debris they produced. When new hiding places appeared between shadows, staying hidden from their own, every attempt to neutralize him turned into a tool in his hands, making it more difficult to capture. The generals could sense authority slipping away from them with each arrow that eroded their self-confidence and the foundation they believed they were invincible because of their authority. But this archer shone how flimsy that notion was. Activities were unrelenting and uncompromising, and because of their conceit, they were unable to grasp the extent of his resolve. To him, this was more than just a skirmish. It was a display of expertise and a lesson in humility that they had to suffer. The generals realized by this point that they were up against more than just a human with a crude weapon. His bow was an example of patience, discipline, and a talent so ingrained that it baffled their comprehension. For the first time, people used an extension of themselves with a confidence that technology could not match. realized that they might not be defeated by a more potent weapon, but rather by someone who had perfected his profession. The archer's communication efficiency rendered their technology nearly obsolete each when he struck. It became evident that his advantage came from his technique rather than his weaponry. They arrived intending to be submissive, but instead they were humbled and they were unprepared for the fight against a fighter who could have driven them to the limit with just his talent. The generals were forced to wait in quiet between attacks, each heartbeat signaled by the possibility of another arrow. Though they believed they knew war, each breath serves as a reminder of their weakness. However, in the presence of encountering the archer, they realized they had only learned a little about it. They believed that war was a test of will rather than the province of machines, and that the person with the strongest will did not win. Most sophisticated weapon, but to the most skilled individual, the general's annoyance had peaked. Discovered that the opponent's abilities challenged all of their preconceived notions about warfare. The archer. They had never expected their confidence to be driven into a defensive position by a single human. Even though they were now doubtful of unshakable, they couldn't accept that one individual. Desperation forced them to intensify their response, using their old weapon, which posed a significant threat. Explosions broke out as he ordered a series of airstrikes to level the region around him using the most potent artillery. Across the terrain, causing the ground to tremble and destroying every tree in sight. In a storm of destruction, they thought they had finally defeated him, leveling slopes and cliffs. They were certain that, by eliminating any potential cover and turning the battlefield into a barren wasteland, they watched the devastation take place, convinced that no one could have survived such an attack, but they also forced him into surrender. When the smoke subsided, they saw something concerning the archer had gone, leaving no trace of his existence. Unnerved but resolute, the general said he seemed to have disappeared into thin air, directed their troops to search the area in the hopes of locating any signs of him, but there. His attempts were fruitless because he had been anticipating their every move and was always one step ahead of them. As he moved through their ranks like a ghost and the landscape changed to rubble, they thought he would find it difficult to avoid their troops, but he once more adjusted by using the devastation they had inflicted as his new terrain. The debris they produced served as his shield, giving him countless chances to hide and launch surprise assaults. Generals stared in shock as he reappeared, his attacks more accurate now. His arrows piercing their undermined defenses by taking advantage of the holes left by their own arrogance. Each strike appearing to make fun of their attempt to overwhelm him, as though he were demonstrating to them the pointlessness of depending only on physical force. His position was only strengthened by attempts to control the battlefield, which allowed him to benefit from their own actions. He was able to easily adjust to every new technique they tried, making their strategies work against them. Undervalued his fortitude, his capacity to turn setbacks into opportunities, and his battlefield expertise, and his mastery of his motions gave the impression that he had practiced each step and shot the generals discovered. Yourself responding to his actions instead of expecting to be pushed into a defensive stance by someone they regarded as archaic. The archer's strategy changed gradually. He no longer aimed only to destroy troops, but specifically targeted vital resources, weaponry, and energy sources, methodically destroying their unable to fight. They watched helplessly as their supplies were depleted and severed by a sequence of blows that exposed them. Each arrow was more than just an assault. It was a strategic maneuver to exhaust their energy and will to keep going. He wasn't just fighting them, he was destroying the generals experienced the effects of each loss and depletion of power piece by piece, of their assets like a tightening hold around their throats. Their hitherto submissive and faithful followers started doubting their commands, pausing at each one. The doubts swiftly proliferated, and the solidarity that had after their forces were established. Soldiers who had previously marched without question started to exchange terrified looked at the person who had swung the odds against them, whispering that they were no longer an unstoppable force, were at risk, unsure. And for the first time terrified of their frustration stemmed not just from their failure to apprehend him, but also from the knowledge that they were confined in a fight in which their technical superiority could not be overcome by force when their formidable weaponry failed to defeat someone who had perfected simplicity. They realized the limitations, not as an archaic relic, but rather as a potent instrument that may breach their defenses in unexpected ways. It's likely that the archer was changing their perspective on combat and making them face the limitations of their technology. And the depths of his expertise, the generals looked at one another, each displaying a common uneasiness they had never encountered. By bringing them to the verge of defeat with his bow and arrows, This human demonstrated to them that their strength was not as absolute, because they felt that as the conflict dragged on, their haughtiness disintegrated and was replaced by increasing admiration for the archer's craft. They were starting to regard him as a master of his trade rather than an adversary, who, as they watched him move strikingly, had exceeded the boundaries they believed defined warfare. With constant focus, they felt confident about the journey they had taken to reach Earth, anticipating a simple victory. A swift conquest of a planet they considered lesser, but here they were drained their troops, crippled their tactics, and were defeated by one individual who had flipped their presumptions against. The archer had demonstrated to them the distinction between mastery and power, between strength and accuracy. As their admiration for him increased, they came to the sobering realization that the battle had run out of choices, changed from a victory to a lesson they didn't want to learn because of their dependence on technology and their conviction that force had been revealed as a flaw, a vulnerability they had not before recognized. They were aware that failing to adjust would cost them not just the fight but also their own respect. Forces that were closely observing and noting the shortcomings of their commanders and those in their last minutes, the generals had to face the unpleasant reality that they had misjudged not only the archer but additionally, they had considered the importance of skill, discipline, and resilience. Qualities were out of date and irrelevant in a world dominated by sophisticated technology, but with every shot, the archer had reminded them that mastery, or the capacity to use even the simplest weapon with purpose and accuracy, and they felt the weight of their own conceit as they saw him, silently reminding them that no amount of strength could ever fully replace the power of a skill that has been practiced by the general's pride destroyed their understanding of combat, and they stood in silence at the end of the attack. Changed, they came to the realization that even with all of their planning and resources, arrive unprepared for a conflict that called for more than just brute power. They had gone in with conceit and gone out with. They would never forget the general's annoyance, since each arrow taught them a lesson in the art of war from a master, had been replaced by a tight stillness. They were no longer amused. Their once proud and impenetrable armies had been reduced to strewn, terrified pieces after each failure. Their attempt to kill or capture the archer had only made them feel more vulnerable than they had ever felt. Experienced, they began to view him as a unique force capable of they assembled for what would be their last effort, one last strategy to destroy them if they committed one more mistake. Regaining power would not involve sweeping bombardments or ceaseless waves of warriors. They realized that he would merely abuse them once more by using their numbers and technology. This time, they decided to use every tactic they could to entice him out by laying a trap that was intended to expose him. They would wait, entice him to one spot, and then hit him with all the general's voices typically used the force they had left with themselves as bait. Their once confident and commanding tones had become so gloomy that they were no longer able to afford conceit, since the archer had showed them the cost of underestimating an adversary. They stood in a circle, representing power, in the hopes that their very presence would be sufficient to bring him out. They could feel the suspense building as the troops carefully positioned their weapons and set up the trap. Was there one hope, their last opportunity to put a stop to what had turned into a terrifying nightmare? But as the seconds passed into, every sound seemed amplified in the silence, and they experienced an unwavering sensation of discomfort. As they waited, the silence grew heavier and the shadow felt deeper. Even though they couldn't see him, they could sense that he was seeing them, because the archer had demonstrated his proficiency with the environment, how to take advantage of the slightest advantage, and they were aware that their final strategy would fail. The first arrow struck without being directed at anything, like a whisper in the wind, broke a vital piece of ICA equipment close to one of the generals, rather than hitting any of them directly. His message was clear. He was aware that they were waiting, and that he would meet them on his own terms rather than fall into their trap. Terms not theirs. Another arrow followed, demolishing with accuracy and determination. The trap they had so meticulously set started to collapse along with another piece of machinery. The generals felt the weight as their positions revealed their meticulously planned strategy disintegrating in front of their eyes. Of loss pressing down on them, their troops were worn out, their resources were diminished, and their strategies had been depleted. Were suddenly unwilling to obey commands as the archer had stolen their pride and sense of dominance, and now even they were no longer regarded as leaders of an invincible army, and their command of their own men was deteriorating. Yet emblems of failure, targets in a game that they were unable to control in the last minutes when they realized how. Of their loss, they had depended on their advanced technology, numbers, and strategies, but none of them had prevented a single resolute warrior from using the bow, an antiquated weapon. Once disregarded as a rudimentary relic, it has demonstrated more power in the hands of a true master. Archer had made them realize that strength and technology weren't always the keys to power, rather, skill and perseverance were. Capacity to adjust and outsmart an adversary. One general couldn't handle the crushing a futile act was born when rank broke, and they charged forward in a last-ditch effort to confront the archer. Instead of using a strategy, he was met with an arrow out of embarrassment and rage, which brought his charge to an instant. A careful and accurate blow that made it clear the archer hadn't simply overcame him, and he did so with a composed efficiency that said a lot. The archer's message was clear: he would not be dragged into careless warfare. The other generals sat in startled silence as she entertained their ideas of heroism or bravery. With that one shot, their troops' hopes of organizing and making a last fight were dashed. Unwilling to confront an adversary who appeared to have no boundaries and dismantled the archer easily breached their defenses, destroying not only their formation but also their resolve to fight, leaving them without anything. Nevertheless, the weight of their conceit and the icy reality of their own weakness, as they stood vanquished, and they experienced an odd sense of clarity in both body and spirit. Their power had arrived. The archer had destroyed it, not by talent or discipline, but more through an unquestioning faith in their own supremacy. Illusion demonstrating to them that in his hands, mastery of one's skill possessed a power that technology alone could never match. The bow had evolved into a weapon that served his own goals and relied on skill rather than brute force. With perseverance, self-control, and comprehension, the generals were forced to withdraw their army in chaos, their pride shattered. They would return to their dominion with a tale they would never forget: that the archer demonstrated to them that one soldier with a basic weapon could vanquish an army through physical force. But through mastery tactics and the determination to stand on their own, they learnt a lesson they hadn't desired to understand, a reality they had come to conquer and couldn't escape. Yet they were the picture of the archer would live on in their thoughts in silence as they left, humiliated and scarred by their own conceit. Uncompromising individual whose talent had exposed their flaws and whose determination had rendered their power appear hollow. He had showed them that genuine strength was found in one's depth of mastery rather than in numbers, and as they withdrew, they realized he and the fight they lost to a lone archer on a planet they had assumed would be theirs will always be remembered. Simple to overcome.